It's time again for Mormon Land, where we explore news in and about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm managing editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined again by senior religion reporter Peggy Fletcher-Stack. Hi, Peggy.
Hi, Dave.
We remind you about another way to support Mormon Land. Just go to patreon.com, where with a small donation, you can access all the Tribune's faith coverage, ad-free podcast episodes, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon. patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's episode. With the recent deaths of Russell Nelson and Jeffrey Holland, Apostle Dieter Uchtdorf moved 2 steps closer to the top rung on the leadership ladder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The 85-year-old Uchtdorf is now the acting president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and stands second in line behind 92-year-old Henry Eyring to take the reins of the global faith. While certainly not wishing death on any church leaders, many Latter-day Saints nonetheless look forward to the prospect of Uchtdorf one day rising to the presidency. What is it about this German apostle that makes him so popular? Is it his backstory as a 2-time refugee, or the fact that he rose from outside the usual church leadership track? Is it his high-flying career as an airline pilot? Is it his sermons filled with soaring rhetoric and down-to-earth wisdom? Or is it his GQ looks and perennial tan? Here to discuss the much-admired apostle who seems to stand out among the faith's top leaders are Latter-day Saint writer Christine Haglund, former editor of Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, and scholar Patrick Mason, chair of Mormon history and culture at Utah State University. Christine, Patrick, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, for both of you, if you can remember, what were your first impressions of Dieter Uchtdorf? And at what point did something stand out about him right away to you? Patrick, you want to start?
Yeah, boy, I'd have to really think about what my earliest memory of him was, but I certainly I think my first association with him is General Conference talks where he talks about being an airline pilot. I think that was a consistent refrain, especially in his earlier talks. It's been a little bit, less so in recent years, but that certainly stood out to me, and just his overall demeanor and charisma at the pulpit just marked him as somebody of just a little bit different stripe than some of his other colleagues.
Christine?
I actually remember an early talk of his where he talks about blowing the bellows for the organ at the chapel in Zwickau when he was a little boy. And that stood out to me, both because I love the organ and because he also talked about a stained glass window, which is also something that I notice and like.
So, Christine, have you heard the term silver fox applied to him?
I have.
And what do you think it conveys?
He's a nice looking man. I mean, it has to be said. We might as well get it out of the way. But yeah.
He's a good looking man.
But he's also, I think he would be good looking just as a still image, but it's also, I think, even more just his demeanor and his warmth. And he's extremely charismatic in that hard to identify and define way.
I think it's also because he has hair, right? There's a lot of apostles who are bald or balding, you know?
Well, it's interesting. He mentions McKay as the prophet of his youth. And someone that he admired. And McKay also was, one who had hair. So maybe that's it.
Can you think of, either of you think of any other current apostles who have nicknames like that?
Not like that. I don't think so.
No, thank goodness.
and I'm not even sure where it came from, but I've certainly heard it a lot.
Yeah.
I heard my aunt tell me when I was writing a speculation story about who would be the new apostles. And she said, "Oh, I hope they pick that silver fox." And I was like, "Who are you talking about?" So I I used it because I hadn't heard of him. And it was one of my only successes in terms of predicting an apostle. And it was because my aunt called him a silver fox.
We'll drill down a little further on some of the specifics, but for each of you, what is it that you like about Dieter Uchtdorf? We've already covered a little bit. Christine, you want to start?
Sure. I think there's a way that Latter-day Saints can revel in their devotion and their suffering for their faith, and he never does. He makes it sound like being a Latter-day Saint is fun and joyful, and he's so delighted also by small things. He's always pointing out things like that stained glass window, or a tiny forget-me-not flower, or delicious Diet Coke. He really does seem like he takes delight in the world, and that's always appealing, I think.
Patrick?
Yeah, picking up on that, there's a kind of warmth about him that he conveys. I like that notion of sort of delight in small things, but he projects. There are lots of ways to be religious and lots of ways of conveying your religiosity. And you can do it through a kind of stern, sort of white knuckling your way to heaven type of way. Or you can do, there's a phrase that people use a lot of sort of the joy of the gospel, the joy of living the gospel. He actually sort of exudes that. And so it doesn't seem like a white knuckle affair. It actually seems like there's a joyfulness in relationship, in relationship with God, in relationship with other people, and he's kind of happy to be along for the ride.
Yeah, now I want you to go into the minds of millions of members and tell me, what do you think other members that you've heard that they see in him that draws them to him or whatever? Patrick?
I think he's a pretty good storyteller. He has evocative imagery, either stories from his own past or parables or other kind of metaphors that become memorable. He doesn't make you feel bad after you've heard one of his talks. He makes you feel good. He has spoken a lot about grace and the grace and the love of Jesus Christ. I think with that, he's been part of a wave of 21st century Mormonism. So he doesn't sound like, maybe, if you grew up in the church and you're our age, he doesn't sound like some of those apostles where it's all about obedience and commandments and so forth. Not that he neglects those things, but there's a greater emphasis on the grace and the love of God that I think is warm and inviting, and I think really well suited for 21st century sensibilities and a 21st century church.
Yeah. Christine?
Patrick kind of hit all the high points. I think, besides being a good storyteller, his sermons often have an arresting visual image in them that sticks. So I was reading through some of his old talks, and there's one where he talks about delivering the laundry on his bicycle. And he says, I wanted to have a nice, sleek, shiny, sporty red bicycle. But then says instead I had a heavy, ugly, black, sturdy workhorse of a bicycle. And there's one extra adjective in there that really gives you time and a cue to see this thing. I've actually wondered if that is because German was his first language and German works that way. All the German compound nouns that everybody makes fun of. Often they describe an abstraction by cramming together a whole bunch of concrete nouns until you can sort of see the idea in your head. And I think his sermons do that a lot. So they're memorable because you can see that one picture that triggers the memory.
So that goes to something I wanted to ask about, and to both of you. We'll start with Patrick. How do you think his rhetoric, his cadence and way of speaking, how are those things unique, even among non-American general authorities? I don't mean to slam the other ones, but I would say he doesn't have a general authority voice, if you know what I mean. What do you think about that, Patrick?
Yeah, I think the fact that he's non-American and that English isn't his first language, but he's extraordinarily fluent, right? Flawlessly fluent, but still with a hint of an accent. So I think for native English speakers, there's something really attractive about that he sounds just different enough where you sort of perk up and listen. He doesn't sound like he's from Bountiful. No offense, to people from Bountiful, or, those of us who live on the Wasatch Front. There is just a kind of cadence and a way we learn to talk at church. And he doesn't sound that way. But on the other hand, he doesn't have such a thick accent. And again, this is where, English is kind of the default language of the church, and English native listeners have lots of privileges when they're listening to General Conference. But he doesn't have such a heavy accent where you can tell that English is clearly a second language, and he might be grasping for words or phrases. So he's sort of in this Goldilocks zone of sounding just different enough, but not too different to really catch your ear as a listener.
What do you think, Christine, about the cadence? And we've already talked a little bit about his use of language.
Yeah, he has a really good sense of rhythm. Sort of, he'll move from a long sentence to a short one, or everyone can remember the long lead up to his phrase, for this, I have some advice. Stop it. And that's the most memorable of those, but he has a good sense for when to put in a sentence with some punch and when to expand out to a poetic metaphor. And that could also be the result of learning a second language, and particularly the switch from German to English, which requires sort of figuring out structures, because German cues by articles of verbs or articles of nouns and putting verbs in different places, and English works a little differently. And I wonder if sort of learning to have a sense for that makes him acutely aware of the rhythm and structure of sentences, because his sermons really are beautiful rhetorically.
It's interesting that you note that, because Abraham Lincoln, undeniably the greatest writer of U.S. presidents, mastered that too. Short sentences, short words with a lot of punch, especially in his second inaugural, things like that. Uchtdorf seems to parrot that, maybe not at quite the same level. But he also can speak kind of bluntly sometimes. Like you just said, stop it. Like if we all remember when he said, frankly, church leaders have made mistakes in the past. He's delivers some kind of, does that give him more power when he's speaking, Patrick?
Well, yeah, I mean, in some ways it's these are basic principles of good public speaking. And that, he, I don't know how intentional he's been. I don't know if he's taken courses. I don't know if he's just, a reader or somebody who pays attention to language. And so, he's clearly thoughtful and intentional about the way that he constructs a sermon. But I think, we're not known in the LDS Church for our expert public speaking. We're known that everybody can public speak, or most people can, and that there's a certain level of comfort, and that's huge, actually. But we're not known for being the greatest orators, because we're a lay church. Unlike other churches where people go to divinity school and seminary and actually learn how to construct and give a sermon, there's a whole art and a science to that. We don't do that. So anybody who does, it's because there's a certain level of intentionality that usually comes from having read a lot, or maybe having listened to other preachers. Maybe the fact that he came from Germany and wasn't immersed in only a purely Latter-day Saint culture. Maybe he had an ear for other types of preaching and speaking, but he certainly brings that kind of intention to his sermons.
Yeah. One more question about the speaking aspect, and we've talked about it already. Uchtdorf talks and even now jokes about it a lot. His aviation background and the metaphors he uses from that. But on the serious side, what does that background in his preaching and his persona do? Yeah, I think it's beyond possibly just being able to use those metaphors and those examples. Christine?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it partly goes to his delight. Like sometimes when he's describing, there was a talk where he talked about the physics of flying a 747 and the lift and the thrust that you need. And then he compares faith and hope to lift and thrust. And so, it's partly, but when he spoke about flying the airplane, his love for that and for the wonder of it is still there. And, besides flying, the other thing that he talks about most, or a lot of the time, is being a child, being an 11-year-old boy. In particular, he often identifies that moment. It's because it's the moment when his family was baptized, but it also seems like a vivid time in his life. And I think he might just be speaking to the 11-year-old boys in the congregation, or to, the child of God in everyone. But that sense of wonder and awe, I think, comes through.
I think there is a kind of cool factor of being an airline pilot that, like, I don't have as a professor, right? I know it's just a job, right? But there is there's a cool factor about it, right? And lots of kids, when they walk in the plane for the first time and they give them those toy little wings to put on, or so, to be able to gaze in the cockpit. There's some kind of modern magic happening there. And the people who fly those big planes, there is a kind of charisma to it.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine seeing Dieter Uchtdorf emerge from the cockpit would give the passengers a lot of confidence that this guy knows what he's doing, right? So, yeah.
Okay, so what do you think his appeal is to American members versus international members? Is it the same appeal? Is it different? How's he helping the churches, church members visualize being in a global church? Christine, do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, I'm inclined to say that it's the same, that just being an authentically Latter-day Saint person with a different background does a lot of work in that space, that just saying, this is my church. He never, he does talk about his conversion, but he has no sense of himself, or doesn't seem to have any sense of himself as, second class, or he's not worried about not having pioneer ancestors. And I think that sets up permission for other people to also, fully embrace the religion and claim it as their own.
There was in a book that I published years ago, there was I had an essay in there from a scholar from Europe who was also a church leader, and he talks about when Elder Uchtdorf was called into the Quorum of the 12, and he recounts this conversation with some other European members of the church, where they said, isn't it exciting now that that we have a European, a German in the Quorum of the 12. And at least by this recounting, the story went that the members, these were German members, and they said, we love Elder Uchtdorf, we're very happy for him, but, and they kind of said with a twinkle in their eye, they said, he is an American after all. that he had spent so much time in the top echelons of corporate culture at Lufthansa, spent so much time as a general authority before he was called into the Quorum of the 12. He's clearly a cosmopolitan, right? He's a guy that you can drop in. He could fit in Europe. He fits in Utah. He could fit in probably anywhere. He just has, and maybe that actually is a kind of European sensibility rather than an American one. But at least by this story, they saw him as somebody who had sort of made that crossover already. That he was a little bit more American than than European. I think he is kind of a both and figure again. I think he's a guy that you could drop in pretty much anywhere and he'd feel at home and make other people feel at home too.
Yeah. So Patrick, Uchtdorf served in a previous first presidency, then was removed from the first presidency. Did that have any effect? Did you notice any effect on him or how members may view him now?
It's an interesting thing. And I've heard, I think there was a lot of talk about it, especially at the time when it happened. He, by all public appearances, he just kept soldiering on, right? He smiled, never complained, never said an ill word about anybody. I don't know what he felt privately. He does, sometimes if you watch really closely, if you're kind of a Vatican watcher or a Salt Lake watcher, you can see there's sort of clusters of general authorities or apostles who seem to kind of be part of little cadres or things like that. I don't know what cadre he's a part of. Maybe he is, and again, a lot of this is kind of occurs in a black box. But I wonder if he isn't and hasn't always been, especially since his return to the Quorum after being in the first presidency, something of his own man. So they always say it's lonely at the top. It's got to be lonely for all of those guys, right? At a certain level, and so they find camaraderie with each other. I don't know who his best friends in the Quorum are. I don't know who the guys that he can have sort of kind of lean on and have private conversations off the record. He does seem to be, and maybe he does, but he does seem to be a little bit, kind of on his own.
Mormon Land will be right back.
Okay, so to both of you, some U.S. members were upset to learn that one of his family members contributed, oh dear, to a Democrat candidate. What do you think? Do you think that perception would change if he became president, church president? And, Jim Faust was a Democrat, but somehow things are, I don't know. What do you think, Patrick?
I'm sure he would never say a word about those kinds of things, and would be extremely close. I have no idea what his political affiliations or leanings are. I actually think that's been one of the things that church leadership has done well in recent decades, is moving away from some of the explicit partisanship and partisan identities that we sometimes saw in the 20th century. Again, you can guess and you can read the tea leaves and, all these kinds of things. But I'm sure he now and at any future point, that is not how he wants to be seen or defined.
What do you think, Christine? Do you think it would change if people thought he leaned left?
I don't think so. I think the people whose partisan identities are most important to them already maybe are a little suspicious. I think the reason that the story of one of his family members contributing to Democrats broke through is that it confirmed feelings that some people already have. But I also think that at this point, most American members are so dug in to their partisan affiliation that there are very few things that would dislodge it.
Okay, Patrick, do you have any idea where he stands on LGBTQ issues or on gender equity?
No, and again, I mean, what we know about him and about most of the leaders is what we hear at General Conference, right, and the occasional other public talks. It's not a topic he's spoken about extensively, but he's look, you don't get into that position in the first place, right? by being a rabble rouser or being, very heterodox on core issues of church doctrine and practice. So there may be some variations. They may have, within the quorum, somewhat different views, but it would be shades rather than a sort of black and white positions. I think anybody who would consider him to be some kind of like far left individual, right, is probably not reading it correctly. But it's just not been a topic that he has said a whole lot about publicly.
I guess that could be telling too, though, that he hasn't said much about it. Correct.
But you could read it multiple ways, right?
Yeah.
Either just he could say there's a lot of other things to talk about. It could be some kind of he's in a somewhat different place from other men in his quorum, or it like, hey, there's plenty of other people talking about that. I'm going to talk about these other things, even if he broadly agrees with the sensibility of the quorum. So I don't even know that silence that you can read too much into silence.
So he's the newly ordained acting president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. What kind of influence, frankly, power, does that give him right now, even without becoming a church president? Christine, do you want to start? And then Patrick?
I'll start. I don't think I have a lot to say. I'm not a great Vatican watcher and I'm not connected in those circles that I would hear rumors. But I think there's at least, there will be several new apostles coming in, and it would make sense that they would look to him to set the tone and direction of how the quorum approaches issues, how they have discussions. So at least in that sort of general atmospheric sense, I suspect he will have a good deal of influence.
Patrick?
I think that's a great point. I think there will be a mentoring role if he chooses to take it towards some of the, more junior apostles. The president or acting president of the Quorum of the 12 does have a lot of power in terms of agenda setting and the kind of assignments and who is sent for various assignments. So when various temples need to be dedicated or stakes need to be reorganized or this or that, the president of the Quorum of the 12 traditionally has played that role of delegation and choosing who will do what. And there is a lot of soft influence and soft power. Anybody who's ever created an agenda for a meeting, that the way you construct an agenda, you can do a lot of work just in the way that you do that. So it is a church hierarchy that is hierarchical. The fact that he is in that president role within the quorum does matter. It's different being number two versus being number one. President Nelson showed us all that, the power of the presidency. And so it may not be obvious to most of us because it'll mostly be inside. But that is a position of significant influence for church operations and assignments.
They do meet separately, right? The whole Quorum of the 12?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I remember writing about Howard Hunter. Unfortunately, he didn't get to the presidency when he was healthy. But as president of the Quorum, he'd love to assign himself travel. The most far-reaching, I'll go there. Hey, I'll go to this temple. I'll go to this stake. He loved it. It's just so sad he didn't get there. He didn't get to because the word I had is that actually Gordon Hinckley hated to travel. And look what happened, Okay, last question. We're going to ask you to speculate and maybe fantasize. What kind of church president do you think he would make? He's inching closer to the presidencies, like only after Eyring. What do you think? Would he be effective? Could he be transformative? I don't know. Christine, you want to start with that? And feel free to fantasize if you want to.
Yeah, I think he could be transformative. It's interesting that you mentioned President Hunter, not getting to be in the position when he could have been a very different sort of president than those who preceded and succeeded him. And I think that is potentially a difficulty for President Uchtdorf. Right now, he's healthy, but he's not young. And so it's a little bit hard. It's hard to know. But I do think that the sort of general warmth and hopeful, positive sense of what it means to be a Latter-day Saint in the world would be different than some of the sterner and more the strong emphasis on obedience and even regimentation of the covenant path. I don't think that's the kind of direction that we would get from him. I also think that his sense of humor is really wonderful, and I think he might teach Latter-day Saints to take themselves a tiny bit less seriously, which would be salutary.
Yeah, Patrick, what do you think?
Yeah, I think were he to become president, it would be another step or half step towards the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints truly being a global religion and being seen as such. Leadership does matter. And so that would be important. I think he would be a beloved president. Christine earlier mentioned President McKay. Now, he was much younger when he became president, so he was president for a very long time. But I do think there's something of him being cut from the same cloth in terms of being that kind of beloved, charismatic leader that the church really identifies with and is proud of. Not just internally, but like, we're kind of proud to show this guy off as the leader of the church. Now, how transformative he would be, there'd be so many factors in terms of his age and health and things like that. But again, President Nelson showed that if somebody comes into the presidency and has a mind to do it and has a to-do list and is willing to flex the muscle of the presidency, it can be a transformative position, even in a very short period of time. Would a Dieter Uchtdorf want to be a muscular president in that way? Would he lean into sort of transforming some of the internal workings of the church? Or would he be more content with conveying a more public image of warmth and hope and grace like we've been talking about? I think, yeah, those are, because does he have a constituency? Does he have people who are lined up ready to do what he says? Or would he meet some level of resistance within the massive bureaucracy? That's all just pure speculation.
Well, Christine Hagelin, Patrick Mason, thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having us.
And thanks to Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners that they keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.